Hi, and today I'm taking a look at the new Canon EF 70-300mm f4 to 5.6 IS USM Mark II. It's the long-awaited update to Canon's aging previous Mark I model, and it's a telephoto zoom lens for Canon's full-frame or APS-C digital SLR cameras, or mirrorless cameras with an adapter. It can be bought new for about £450 or about $500 US, a touch more expensive than the third-party competition, but this is a much newer lens. Never mind having an instruction manual, this thing comes with its own book, which includes information all about the lens's electronics and the various foibles you can expect if attaching it to an older film SLR camera. I couldn't find my old film SLR to check how well it worked, unfortunately, although it should be basically fine. If ever you're on the market for one, I really like the EOS 300V. Anyway, you all know what this kind of lens is. 70-300mm telephoto zooms are very popular, and there are a huge number of them available. On a full-frame camera, 70-300mm gives really nice coverage for general-purpose photography, although it falls a little shy of getting you seriously close to the action. But if you mount this on an APS-C camera, you'll get the equivalent of 480mm, a really close picture, especially for smaller subjects. The maximum aperture of f4 to 5.6 is not very bright, so you won't be getting the most out-of-focus backgrounds or fastest shutter speeds, but that's normal for a telephoto zoom lens in this price range. The lens has image stabilization, which is extremely useful for getting sharper still pictures and smooth video footage. Here's some footage with it turned off, and now turned on. The stabilization works silently, and as you can probably see, it's one of the most efficient I've tested. It holds your image very still, even at 300mm. Nice. The lens is a little bit big, and it has a 67mm filter thread on the front. It weighs just over 700 grams, so it feels a touch hefty, but actually that's a little lighter than other 70-300mm lenses out there. The build quality is good, but not fantastic. It's perfectly fine, but the plastic materials it's made of feel a tiny bit wobbly. It's based on a metal lens mount. There's no weather sealing gasket included, but the rear glass element of the lens is fixed in place, which offers some sealing against dust and moisture. Most of the lens's body is occupied by the large zoom ring. Straight out of the box, I was disappointed to find that it doesn't turn all that smoothly. It's not bad, but hopefully they loosen up a tiny bit over time. In case it ever gets really loose, there's a zoom lock switch available to keep it locked at 70mm if you want. However, the focus ring at the end feels really smooth to turn. It's nicely damped. It's electronically coupled to the focus motor. If you want to adjust focus manually, then either set the lens to manual focus, or if you're in autofocus mode, you'll be able to make adjustments when half pressing your camera's shutter button. The mechanism works very responsively. Now, this lens features Canon's new Nano USM autofocus motor, which is meant to combine the speed of USM autofocus with the efficiency and control of STM autofocus. Let's see how fast it is. Wow, you're seeing that right? The motor is able to go back and forth throughout the entire focus range accurately within a fraction of a second. It only slows down a little when you're zoomed all the way into 300mm, but even then it's still crazy fast. That is easily the fastest and most efficient autofocus system I have ever tested. It's essentially silent too, although if you hold your ear right against the lens, you can hear a gentle whirring sound. When you're shooting through the viewfinder, I can tell you that the mechanism is lightning fast and very accurate, the fastest and most accurate I've ever tested. When you're using a Canon camera with their dual pixel autofocus feature and you're shooting video or in live view mode, as you can see here, it's a touch slower, but still as fast as you're going to get in live view mode. If you're using a Canon camera without dual pixel autofocus and shooting in live view mode, like I am here with my little Canon EOS M3, then the autofocus will be slower. That's just a limitation of the camera you're using. The lens has a nifty little LCD display at the bottom, which turns on when you half press your camera's shutter button, and that display has 3 different modes. Most people will probably just use the focus display mode. As you zoom the lens in and out, the depth of field scale at the bottom of it adjusts itself accordingly, which is neat. The second mode shows your focal length. Totally pointless if you're shooting on a full frame camera, as the focal length is printed on the zoom ring 1 centimeter above. But if you're shooting on an APS-C camera, it'll show the full frame equivalent you're working with, which is a cool idea. And finally, the third mode is an indicator of how much your camera is shaking, according to the image stabilization system. I think Canon were clutching at straws here to show something useful on the screen, but some people might find it pleasantly hypnotizing to watch. You can switch between different modes by pressing the Mode button, or invert its colors by holding down the button for a couple of seconds or so. You can also switch it on or off by holding the Mode button down for even longer. So overall, while I wasn't completely in love with the feel of the lens's build quality, its electronics are astonishingly good. I really hope Canon will upgrade some of its L lenses with Nano USM. That would be a dream come true. Anyway, image quality. This lens's predecessor had a seriously mixed reputation. Let's see how this one works on a full frame camera, my 20 megapixel Canon 6D. By the way, I do plan on upgrading to a higher resolution full frame camera sometime soon. I've turned on in-camera corrections for this test. At 70mm and f4, the lens is fantastically sharp in the middle with great colours and contrast. The corners, however, are a bit soft. Stop down to f5.6 for a tiny improvement, but it's only at f8 that those corners are finally looking pretty good. Let's zoom in to 135mm. At f5, the middle of the image is fairly sharp. The corners are better than they were at 70mm though, and at f8, there's a fantastic increase in image quality. And finally, 300mm. At f5.6 in the middle, the lens is also pretty sharp, and the corners are quite good. Stop down to f8 for a very good image quality in those corners. So, on a full frame camera, I think the lens is pleasingly sharp and it gives fairly consistent results. It's a fair bit sharper than its Mark I predecessor, but it's certainly not as good as Canon's 70-300mm L lens. I looked back at my test images from that review and I found the L lens to be quite a lot sharper. Let's test the lens on a camera with a smaller APS-C sensor now, my 24 megapixel Canon EOS M3. At 70mm and f4, the image quality is okay in the middle and a touch soft in the corners. But stop down to f5.6 for a big improvement in sharpness there and back in the middle of the image too. And it's just as sharp when you stop down to f8. So that's a good start at the wide angle end. Let's zoom into 135mm. It's the same situation really. With the aperture wide open, sharpness is quite good in the middle and the corners are just okay. Stop down to f8 for a nice improvement. We get very good image quality across the image frame now. Finally, we'll zoom into 300mm. The good news is that image quality is holding up quite well. At f5.6 it's still reasonably sharp in the middle of the image. Corners are a touch soft, but stop down to f8 for a good improvement and f11 for another tiny improvement. So even on a 24 megapixel APS-C camera, the lens is performing quite consistently. Image quality is always fairly good, and stop down the aperture to f8 for nicer results. Let's see about distortion and vignetting. They're not a problem on an APS-C camera, but how about on full frame? At 70mm, we see noticeable barrel distortion, and at f4, there's a little darkness in the corners. Stop down to f5.6 to push that vignetting away, and at f8, it's finally gone. If you zoom into 100mm, then that distortion straightens out. At 300mm, we see some noticeable pincushion distortion and more vignetting at f5.6, but at f8, that's gone. So for a 70-300mm lens, it's an average performance for distortion, but I would say an above average performance for vignetting. The lens can focus down to about 1.2 meters, not bad for smaller subjects. At f5.6, the image quality remains nice and sharp, and at f8, it's a touch sharper again. A good performance. Let's see how the lens works against bright light. There's some soft looking but pretty major flaring at all focal lengths, typical for this kind of lens. It would be worth getting a lens hood to go with this and to use it whenever you can. And finally, bokeh. That's a strong point of the lens. I'm pleased to say that when you get pictures with an autofocus background, those backgrounds always look nice and soft. No problems to report here. Well, this has been a long review. This new telephoto lens from Canon really is laden with impressive electronic features, and the further good news is that its image quality is pretty nice for the money you're paying. As I mentioned before, it's a good step upwards from its Mark I predecessor, while not being as sharp as Canon's 70-300mm L lens, which is obviously made of much more expensive materials. Owners both of Canon's full-frame or APS-C digital cameras will be pretty satisfied with this new piece of kit, and the price is reasonable enough, so it certainly comes recommended.